Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the fourth meeting of the Automotive Right to Repair Working Group. We're going to start the afternoon with a public hearing. But before we do that, one housekeeping issue, and then I'll ask members to introduce themselves. A couple people have brought to my attention that on the Zoom video, when people are watching it by Zoom, on the recording, it's sometimes hard to understand or to see who's speaking because the camera is kind of far away and you can't always tell who on the horseshoe is talking. So what I think makes sense is if a member of the group wants to speak, and this is not a power play on my part, I'm not trying to control things, but why don't you just let me recognize you? I'll recognize you by your name, and that way people will know who's speaking, and then you can just go ahead and speak. So just put your hand up or whatever. I'll say your name, and then you should feel free to speak after that. Again, this is just so folks that are watching it on Zoom understand who on the committee is speaking. So with that, why don't we just start with introductions, and let me start to my left. Looks like yeah.
Tim Winkler, VIP Tires and Service.
Tommy Hickey, Director of the Right to Repair Coalition.
Jeff Groves, the Aftermarket Parts Distributors and Retailers.
And I actually didn't, Christina, why don't you introduce yourself? I didn't introduce you.
Christina Moylan from the Attorney General's office.
And I'm Chris Taub from the Attorney General's office.
Elizabeth Frazier, partner at Pierce Atwood, representing the Alliance for Automotive Innovation, which are the auto manufacturers.
Lynn Gardner from the Bureau of Motor Vehicles. I'm here on behalf of the Secretary of State.
All right, and so then on Zoom we have Brian. Brian, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, this is Brian Boggs representing Tesla and the auto manufacturers.
All right, and Katrina, can you introduce yourself?
Hi, Katrina Fitzgerald, Deputy Director at the Electronic Privacy Information Center, a nonprofit advocacy group dedicated to the right to privacy.
All right, and Alicia, are you filling in for Megan Sway today?
Yes, Alicia Ray with the ACLU of Maine.
Okay. And I think Jack Cork is on, but I'm not sure he is.
Yes,
Jack?
yeah. Hello, can you hear me all right?
Yeah, we can hear you great.
I'm here.
All right, can you just introduce yourself, Jack?
Sure, Jack Quirk Auto Group, Maine.
All right. And I think Eric is joined now too. Eric, are you there? And can you introduce yourself?
I am here. Yeah, Eric Lefton, Senior Vice President for Dornan Products, representing the Aftermarket Parts.
All right, great. So we have everyone here. So as I mentioned just a couple minutes ago, we are going to have a public hearing to start off the session. And I guess there's just kind of a few things I want to frame up to help kind of focus the public hearing. The focus of this group and sort of what we've been directed to do by the legislature through a resolve that they passed last session, and I'll just quote from right from the resolve, which is that the Attorney General is convening a working group to develop recommendations for legislation to establish an entity with rulemaking and enforcement authority to adopt standards governing access to motor vehicle telematics systems and to authorize and to otherwise implement and enforce the requirements of the Maine Revised Statutes, Title 29A, Section 1810. The working group will develop recommendations for legislation to establish an entity to ensure cybersecure access to motor vehicle generated data to owners and owner-authorized independent repair facilities for maintenance, diagnostic, and repair purposes. So I just want to sort of make clear that the job for this group, it's not to decide whether or to what extent car manufacturers should allow owners and independent repair facilities to have access to telematics systems and vehicle information. That's a decision that the people of the state of Maine and the legislature have already decided is going to happen. And it's also not our job to decide sort of how that's going to happen. In other words, how access to telematic systems and vehicle generated information is going to be best provided to owners and to independent repair facilities. That's really something that the independent entity or this entity that the Attorney General and the working group is tasked with developing recommendations for is going to be considering. So really what our job is just to do is to provide recommendations to the legislature regarding how they should establish this entity that is going to do those things. So given that that is the purpose of our group, that our purpose is not to decide on the wisdom or the public policy behind telematic access and vehicle information access, given that our job is to develop recommendations for this entity, we are going to limit public testimony today to people who want to comment on things like how this entity should be formed, how it should be structured, what its specific duties should be, what kind of authority it should have, like what kind of rulemaking authority, what kind of enforcement authority it should have, whether it should have funding, whether it should have staffing, sort of all of the things that kind of go into establishing this entity. So we are going to ask everyone to sort of keep to that topic. We do recognize that people have a lot of different views about, to what extent manufacturers should be providing access. But again, that's sort of not what we're here today for. So we are going to ask you to focus your testimony on the issue of how we go about creating this independent entity. We're going to limit testimony to 5 minutes. Although after you're finished with your testimony, please remain here so members can have a chance to ask any questions that they might have. What I'll do is when we hit 5 minutes, if you're still talking, I'll just ask you to wrap up in a sentence or two. We're not requiring, unlike a committee, we're not requiring the submission of written testimony, but if you have documents or things that you've written or other information that you think the working group should have, please feel free to give it to Katrina, who's at the end of the horseshoe. What she will do is she'll get it up onto our website so all the members of the group have access to it as well as members of the public. I think in terms of logistics, what we're going to do is we will start with people who are in the room who want to provide testimony to the group. And then once we're finished with people in the room, we'll move to people who are participating via Zoom who want to give testimony. And just to kind of give people a heads up who are on Zoom on the logistics of how this is going to work. What we'll do is after we finish hearing testimony from folks in the room, I'll ask everyone who's on Zoom who wants to provide testimony to the group to raise their electronic hand. And then what will happen is that one by one, Katrina is going to promote each person who's raised their hand to what's called a panelist position, which means that person will be able to appear in front of us and speak to us. What'll happen is you're going to get like a little pop-up on your screen that's going to be telling you that Katrina is trying to promote you to panelist status. And so when she does that, you just have to make sure that you click accept onto that pop-up so that then you will get promoted. And there is a little bit of a delay that will happen between when we say that we're going to promote you and when you actually appear on screen here. So don't panic. It just takes the internet a little while to magically transport you from wherever you are in the world to our room. And then if you could turn on your camera, that would be helpful once you get promoted so we can both hear and see you. You can go ahead and provide your testimony. We'll keep you on screen to see if any people have questions for you. And then once you're done, we'll put you back into sort of observer status. And then Katrina will move on to the next person who has their hand raised, promote that person, and we'll just go from there. Katrina, is that the right? Okay, great. I got that right. And then just, I guess one last thing I should have mentioned is that when you first begin your testimony, it'd be helpful if you could just introduce yourself with your first and last name. If you're representing a business or an organization or some kind of entity, if you could just tell us who you're here for. If you're not here on behalf of anyone, if you could maybe just provide us with where you're from, if you're from Maine, what town you live in. So let me stop and just ask the members of the group if they have anything. If there's anything else that I should have conveyed or if there's any comments they want to make before we start with the hearing. And Katrina.
If you are presenting from the room, please make sure that before you start speaking that you turn on the microphone at the center table.
Yeah, great. Thank you for that. I forgot about that. All right, anything else anyone wants to address? All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask anyone who wants to provide comments to the working group to take a seat here, turn on the mic, and tell us what you want to say.
Good afternoon. Thank you for allowing me to comment today on this very important issue. My name is Andreas Heiss. I'm the Government Affairs Manager for the Northeast for LKQ Corporation. LKQ has 50 employees at 4 facilities in Maine. These are in Gorham, Gardner, Bangor, and Portland. LKQ are the leading provider of alternative and specialty parts to repair and accessorize your automobile and other vehicles. We offer a broad range of replacement systems, components, equipments, parts, and services to repair, calibrate, accessorize trucks and recreational performance vehicles. We employ 15,000 people nationwide and operate 440 facilities in 46 states. I would like to start by commending this working group on taking the time to hash out the issues to work towards meeting the requirements from this voter-passed referendum to develop an independent entity to ensure cybersecure access to motor vehicle generated data. This is for the owners and owned authorized independent repair facilities of maintenance, diagnostics, and repair purposes. The independent entity is a key element in the referendum supported by the overwhelming majority of Mainers calling for direct access to their vehicle diagnostic repair information and the right to take their vehicles to where they want to get it repaired. After all, they bought the car, they pay for the repairs, they should have the information to fix it. We have heard from many stakeholders, and one thing is clear, this is a complicated issue, and the referendum calls for implementation overseen by a body with both the knowledge and enforcement power to make it work. Within the requirements of the referendum, the entity will create the standards for securely transmitting the repair data before and when it is needed to repair a car. Therefore, the entity needs to be comprised at a minimum of experts from all the stakeholders in this working group. The entity should include experts capable of keeping up with ever-changing advancements in technology. We have seen examples of how telematics has changed the way repair data is communicated, from letting a repairer know when a maintenance issue pops up with a consumer's vehicle, to having the access to repair the vehicle once it's in the shop. The entity needs to be able to make changes in the law and adopt regulations and adapt so that it remains effective. One of our companies, Elite Tech Vehicle Services, will come to any repairer to provide mobile reflashing, programming, and diagnostic assistance to fully benefit all the car owners in Maine. We work with the independent repairer so they can repair a greater variety of makes and models, allowing them to compete with larger shops and dealerships. Having a nimble entity composed of experts that can keep up with the changes in technology would allow us to continue to effectively serve the Maine independent repair industry and help us do our part to ensure that Mainers continue to have a choice of where they repair their vehicles. In addition to expertise, the entity needs to have the enforcement power to make sure that the law is implemented in a way to fully benefit all repairers and car owners. Should there be an issue with compliance, how many small repair shops or car owners will sue Ford, Chevy, or Toyota? The entity must be able to work with and have the backing of the Attorney General's office or other state agency so that the independent repairers and car owners are not placed with the burden of having to enforce the law through private action. This is a very important thing for the entity. Last November, Mainers voted to take control of who can repair their car. The manufacturers are required to share the diagnostic and repair data for your car with you. Creating an entity with both the adaptability and enforcement power ensures that the voters' wishes are preserved well into the future. Thank you again for giving me the opportunity to speak to this working group. And if anybody has any questions, I can take those now.
Great, thank you so much. Any questions from members of the group? All right, seeing none, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Chairman Taub and members of the working group. My name is William Bell. I'm the Executive Director of the Maine Auto Recyclers Association. And taking the chair's admonition about not relitigating the reason that we're here, I will be very brief in saying that there are 4 reasons going back to 1830. We always try to improve upon what Massachusetts has done. Maine is a used car state. In fact, according to U.S. Department of Labor, Maine has the highest per capita number of used car dealerships of any state. Maine ranks 30th among all states in per capita income, and when you adjust this for cost of living, Maine ranks 42nd. And unlike the southern states, which share this low income status, Maine winters exact a severe toll on vehicles. In some, Mainers drive aging cars whose warranties have expired and need to access repair facilities other than just the dealership. We urge the working group in creating this entity to make right to repair work, and to maximize this entity's authority and ability to function. And at this point, maybe I can just relate a little bit from personal experience. The entity needs to be bold. And there's always, well, why do we have to do this in Maine? But I was a staff person in the Maine legislature going way back to when the bottle bill was passed. And the opponents of the bottle bill, I had a bumper sticker, said the bottle bill will only make things worse. But Maine became the first state to have a broad-based bottle return bill, and lots of other states have followed. In 2021, Maine became the first state to pass extended product responsibility, a law in packaging, pushing producers to use less wasteful packaging. And out of necessity, Maine has recently become the first state to pass comprehensive laws to prevent PFAS, pernicious chemicals, from entering the environment. With specific regard, so we should not be daunted by the idea of, gee, why does little Maine have to be out here doing this? We happen to be good at it. And we have a population that needs this. With specific regard to automobiles, in the face of rampant theft of catalytic converters, Maine 2 years ago passed a law with more comprehensive requirements than those of any other states with regard to how catalytic converter sales are conducted, et cetera. I was a member of the working group that constructed and unanimously supported this law, and it's working. I'm also part of another Bureau of Motor Vehicles working group, which happens to be meeting at exactly the same time, looking to propose to the next legislature what may be the first law in the country, carefully defining the requirements for online used car sales, used car firms selling into the state. Carvana is a member of that working group and looking forward to having Maine's law become a national model. So again, please don't shy away in what you're setting up to do. And just a note, and I'm not trying to direct something over to your lap, but in both these working groups, the Maine Secretary of State's office has played a very important and constructive role. Maine's auto recyclers look forward to having a similar thoughtful, bold, and comprehensive recommendation coming forth from this committee. And by the way, just again, from personal observation over the years, it needs to be, in my view, housed as part of a state, be part of a state entity. Independent groups, and I remember when Angus King became governor, he set out and had most of these independent groups abolished because they just became hard to justify. And I think do not make that mistake of thinking you can have a totally independent group, not affiliated and housed somewhere. And thank you for your time.
If you just stay there for 1 minute. Thank you so much. Any questions for Mr. Bell? Christina Moylan.
Hi. Yeah, thank you. To your last comment about the entity would be better off housed in an existing state agency, do you have any opinion on where?
Bureau of Consumer Affairs, I think that's the name of it, within the Attorney General's office might be one logical one. The Secretary of State's Bureau of Motor Vehicles has handled other new tasks, but frankly, that's a law enforcement agency, and they're very good at it. But this goes beyond law enforcement. So again, the word consumer, I think, is key here.
Thanks.
Any other questions? I have one question. So this kind of is a follow-up to what Christina was asking you, but I'm just wondering if you can maybe flesh out a little bit more why you think it'd be better to house this entity within a state agency rather than having it sort of be a freestanding, independent or quasi-independent entity.
Because orphans don't do well. I mean, I hope I haven't insulted any orphans, but it's just kind of tough when you don't have somebody giving some guidance and taking responsibility for the entity's survival and meaningful work. And that's just a very personal outlook, but I've been around for a while.
I appreciate that. Any other questions? All right, thank you very much. All right, is there anyone else in the room who would like to provide testimony? Going once, going, oh, yes.
All right. Good afternoon, Chair Taub, members of the Right to Repair Working Group. I'm Representative Tiffany Roberts, representing House District 149, and I serve as the Chair of the Innovation Development, Economic Advancement, and Business Committee, or just Idea B, if that's easier. This legislative committee proposed the bill that formed this Right to Repair Working Group. I do understand that today's public comment period is intended to focus specifically on the creation of the independent entity tasked with overseeing the right to repair law. However, it is essential to recognize that addressing the entity in isolation is not possible, given the broader issues embedded in the law. The entity's structure, function, and ultimate success are inextricably tied to the law's core premises of consumer protection and fair access to repair information. Without a comprehensive view of these interrelated elements, we risk creating an entity that cannot fill its intended role. First, I would like to thank Chair/AAG Taub, it's a little unclear, for leading this group and for giving the grace that typical citizens initiatives may receive. As there's no clear way of telling where they've come from. There's not been a vetting legally or legislatively. This group must be aware that, however, with this law, that's not the case. This law remains in litigation in Massachusetts, and a carbon copy has been introduced in Washington, D.C. before an actual implementation in either of these two states it passed referendum in. It begs the question, if this is the consumer issue, the intent claims, why not propose a bill to the legislature? I surely would have entertained it. Our committee formed this group without that option after encountering significant obstacles in passing a committee bill designed to protect consumers and repair facilities. Unfortunately, despite the broad bipartisan support, the bill was met with intense opposition and did not advance. The formation of this group was meant to address the issues that remain unresolved. The right to repair law and the ballot initiative that preceded it were presented as consumer protection measures, a cause I'm deeply committed to. It's no secret to most in this room or in the building that I have and will continue to fight to ensure consumers have the rights and resources that they need. This group's work was meant to guarantee consumers access to vehicle repair information empowering them to seek repairs at independent repair shops, and leaving private data access control where it is. Yet, much of the discussion in this room has shifted toward business concerns, particularly between independent repair shops and manufacturers. While fairness in the marketplace is important, it is certainly not the role of one state's government to mediate a marketing feud between industries, especially when the voters were promised consumer-focused protections. As the working group deliberates on establishing this independent entity, I urge you to keep Maine's consumers at the forefront. This entity is crucial to ensuring the law functions as intended, balancing access to vehicle data with protecting proprietary information. It's a delicate balance, and the priority must be to serve consumers and not advance industry agendas. Several challenges exist in determining how this entity will operate. One key issue is introducing a data access platform, specifically a specific one that has either been created or is being created. It's not clear. This significant detail was not discussed during the legislative discussion, despite the exact question of its existence being asked. I sincerely hope this group sees that while such a platform may be necessary for managing data exchanges, it raises significant cybersecurity concerns. The platform must have robust protections to ensure consumer privacy and safeguard sensitive data from breaches. It also begs the question of who will be paying for the platform or the entity. The entity itself, manufacturers, consumers, something the committee also never got an answer to. A key unresolved issue remains understanding why an independent entity, and we've heard this kind of already, is necessary to put into effect the intent of the voters to ensure the right to repair. The proponents of the independent entity have suggested it's necessary to play referee, but their own ballot question, which they wrote, would establish industry players, the foxes, as the guardians of this new system, the henhouse. Surely a government entity would be a more transparent and disinterested third party, wouldn't it? Beyond these foundational concerns are more practical but equally important implementation issues. The lack of a clear definition of independent repair shop in the statute. Without clear definitions, we risk creating ambiguities, undermining the law's intent. For example, the law provides that information must be made necessary for repairs, maintenance, and diagnostics. Does diagnostics include active monitoring of the vehicle for low oil, tire pressure, or other ongoing routine maintenance needs? If so, that would require continuous access. Personal data protection, cybersecurity, this all falls under the entity. The independent entity must have clear protocols to manage these challenges effectively, ensuring accountability and technical functionality. Concerns about transparency are significant. The public and the federal government, through the National Highway Transportation and Safety Administration, expect this entity to be accountable and operate in a way that protects their rights. With unresolved questions about the platform's operation and cybersecurity measures, we must ensure that the entity fulfills its purpose and remains focused on consumer protections. Without a definition of independent repair shop, that leaves no statutory guidelines to protect consumers to ensure anyone with the ability to access their vehicle has been sufficiently trained and equipped to handle the sensitive security matters associated with access to a vehicle. My colleagues and I have put much time, effort, and research into this issue. I want to emphasize the need for a transparent entity capable of addressing good governance, cybersecurity, and consumer protection. The focus remaining on protecting consumers as the law was initially presented, and determine if that's best for Mainers and what they thought they were getting when they voted for the referendum. This is not about resolving industry disputes, but safeguarding consumer rights as promised to Maine voters. I thank you for your time and indulgence in going over 5 minutes. I'm aware. And I look forward to listening to the continuing discussion.
Yeah, I followed the informal rule that the clock doesn't run against a legislator. So you did go a little bit over, but yes.
I like to extend the same. So.
Are there any questions for Representative Roberts? Yeah, Christina.
I thought you might get to this, but just in case you don't. Thank you, Representative Roberts. You mentioned a number of items that you thought need clearer definition or clearer safeguards and protocols. Do you think that giving the entity rulemaking authority and providing some guidance to the entity about the areas that rulemaking are expected on would help in that regard?
Thank you for that, because there's a lot I couldn't add in here because I didn't have time. But so I'm going through, I'm looking at like our quasis, like FAME and MTA, and I'm not aware that any quasis have actual rulemaking and enforcement authority. So to me, if you ask me what this should look like, I'm going to say a regulatory body, licensure, standards, performance standards, everything under the Department of Professional and Financial Regulation, or OPOR, which would require a sunrise review and et cetera. Again, couldn't fit all that in. But to me, if you're handling this data, that's licensure. We license our dealers. Thanks.
Any other questions for Representative Roberts? So, Representative, I just want to ask, I mean, it sounds like, you have some concerns about sort of the way that the statute was drafted. And I don't disagree that there are some issues with it. This was citizen initiated legislation. So OPLA wasn't involved, our office wasn't involved. So we're sort of given the statute that we're given. But I guess the question is, given that is the law, do you have any thoughts about, to the extent that we do have concerns about how it was drafted or how some of its provisions might operate, like what this entity can do about that?
I believe that this working group has a report back with recommendations, and that one legislature cannot bind another.
And do you have thoughts about what kind of recommendations this group should make?
I believe that our thoughts were apparent in our 11-to-1 bill.
And just for those of us, or for those people who might not be familiar, can you just describe what that bill was?
So 1911 was it? Nope. The committee bill that we put forth, basically what it did is around kind of the European language, but larger, but it took out the platform and the entity, and it just mandated that manufacturers provide the same tools that they provide to their dealerships.
Yeah. So, right. So it sounds like you're suggesting that we don't really necessarily need to have an independent entity, that another model would be just to have direct statutory obligations.
Yeah. I mean, to be honest, I was extremely surprised and confused when listening to the last meeting about a platform that we had asked about, that I think in the first meeting said it wasn't actually a thing. It was just like a I forget what Mr. Hickey said in one of the meetings, or was it Gallagher, that it wasn't an actual thing. And then all of a sudden it was a thing, and we had asked about it. So that, now I'm a little curious as to what's going on here. And because that sounds like it costs money.
Any other questions? Christina?
To that last point about a platform, and I recall the confusion earlier about whether there would actually be a platform that is something that the independent entity has control of versus some mechanism that the entity requires the individual manufacturers to be in charge of for their own data. Is that what you were referring to?
I mean, if we go on the premise that telematics are needed for repairs, which from my research and the various conferences and conversations I've had, that's not the case. It's really hard for me to answer that. I mean, that's like me saying, like, I would like an operating system that works on both Macs and PCs because I need it to write documents. Well, is that true? Like, I don't.
And I guess where I was going with that is, if the entity does not have custody of some thing that includes the data, but rather the data is housed at the manufacturer and the entity prescribes some common set of rules that all of the manufacturers have to adhere to in how to make that data available. Does that address some of the concerns that you're articulating?
I don't want to speak to that because to me, that sounds like we're diving into some kind of federal regulations as far as liability and things like that. And I don't want to speak out of turn on that, but that's another thing to take into consideration is the federal regulations around this and the fact that we're doing it in just one state.
Okay, thanks.
Any other questions?
Yeah, it's a question just for clarity. I'm trying to understand because on one hand you say it's all about the consumer and consumer choice.
Eric, I just want to say that that's Eric who's speaking. We just couldn't.
Oh, sorry about that.
Really. Yeah, no, that's fine.
Yeah, I'm just
go ahead.
Just trying to get clarity in my own mind. So on one hand, I hear you speaking about wanting to support the main consumers on freedom of choice, and the main voters have spoken. But then more than half the discussion here was all the reasons why this shouldn't go forward as is and shouldn't be supported. So I'm just trying to reconcile, like, are you for the main consumers or are you not for the main consumers?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that again?
Yeah, so you mentioned, this should be about the main consumers. Totally agree. And quite frankly, take a little bit of offense to being called a fox. But trying to understand, on one hand, you say you're all about the main consumer and we need to focus on the main consumers. But on the other hand, it sounds like you're highlighting why, this shouldn't go forward as is with this group, putting in place guidelines, so on and so forth. So I'm just trying to understand, you mentioned about the main consumer, but then you said it should be national. Are you about the main consumers or are you not about the main consumers?
Well, I believe that if you ask anyone in this building or in my constituency, that they will tell you that I am 100% for main consumers. I don't believe, I will have to reread my comments that I said this should not exist. And I think you might be referencing how I initially came out against the ballot initiative because I had read the bill and saw significant gaps in the language in the policy itself. If that's what you're referring to, I am 100% for consumer protections, working, on other issues that have cost consumers millions. We have to be responsible about this. And so just looking at an entity, it's like, okay, well, we really need to look at the whole problem. Like, give me a bill, put it in committee. Let's hash it out. Let's figure out the best way to do this. Because I'll tell you, when my district got geofenced over that bill, and I got over 83 phone calls from people saying I was voting against their will, and I explained to them the issues that I had in the language in the bill, which they didn't even know there was a law attached to the ballot measure they voted on. Only 2 people out of those 83 that I returned their phone calls disagreed when we hung up.
Thank you.
Yeah. No, Elizabeth, why don't you go ahead?
Going back, actually sort of follow up to Tina's question, I think, because of starting to drill down a little bit on how the independent entity might look and what, its roles and responsibilities might be. And I'm thinking of sort of maybe, our typical, right, we have a typical office of whatever, let's say, it's under the AG's office. We'll pick on you for a minute. Let's say we stick it over there in the AG's office. Based on the current language of the ballot initiative, the independent entity has the responsibility for determining who and how authorization occurs for that data. Let's say we stick it under Tina's office. To me, that would shift the liability for that authorization to the state. And I was just curious whether you thought that, in your research for other quasi-entities and existing regulatory agencies, whether or not that role as an authorizing agency is something that's appropriate for state government.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that if the state was the authorizing agency for the data, that sounds like it would conflict with NHTSA's guidance around the manufacturers being responsible for the data. But I'm not sure. And off of that too, my husband was going to come up today, but he had a manufacturing crisis. he works on our cars at home all the time. And he's like, well, so I help the neighbors too. Am I an independent repair facility? Do I get access? Do I have to be an LLC? So would he get it? Who would give it to him? I mean, and we haven't passed a comprehensive privacy bill in Maine yet, which is another huge thing. I mean, I can go all day. I mean, it's.
Well, let's see if there's any other questions.
You're in my wheelhouse. You want to stay here? We can stay here.
Are there any other questions? Yeah, Jeff.
The issue of liability was just raised, and assuming that the solution does not include the state housing a database or being responsible for any data in a cybersecure way, assuming that this independent entity is only formulating policies by which manufacturers would then follow. Do you believe that the state sovereign immunity statute would apply to any immunity then that might arise with respect to the state? There's a specific statute on that. It's pretty broad. There's a specific exemption for legislative acts or quasi-legislative acts. I'd just like your thoughts on that.
No, I'm semi-familiar in that I've read it. Now, I'm not an attorney, so I think that would be something that the Attorney General's office would have to figure out. So if it wasn't for the data, then why would the entity exist? If they are existing just for licensure and regulation of the independent repair shops, is that, I guess, so that seems like that's driving away from the language of the referendum bill. So I'm not sure which way you want to go there.
Well, I'm just trying to establish whether or not we think there's this issue of whether or not the state might have some liability is an issue that we really should be focusing on or not.
I think that at least it needs to be explored. I mean, whether it's a hyper focus, not if you look at it and say.
I mean, it probably depends on what the independent entity ultimately is charged with doing and whether or not they're going to house data or not house data, as the case may be.
Or even grant access to or deny. You know?
Yeah, I frankly, I don't think my opinion is the independent entity would not be doing any of that. They would be simply focused on the policies by which the manufacturers would then, the rules of the road. They would not be housing data and they would not be doing that. But I just wanted to talk about the liability issue since it was raised. Thank you.
I think it needs to be explored. Absolutely.
Are you aware of any?
Let me just to give your names so people know who's talking.
Tommy Hickey, Director of the Right to Repair Coalition. Are you familiar? Do you know of any safeguards that are on car manufacturers when they're collecting this data of what they can do with this data or not do with this data? Any state laws or federal laws?
I know that California has looked at some privacy laws. So and actually, if you look at Maryland and Connecticut, but I believe Connecticut's model has passed in 12 states now as far as consumer data and privacy, something that we're, obviously looking at. We looked at something a little bit more aggressive here in Maine. So yes, it's catching on. Ideally, that should kind of be a federal thing, I would think. But if 12 states are already doing that, then I think that that's what's catching on. So my conversations have been, and these aren't from the CEOs of any of these, is that companies are wanting to move away from holding data because that's not, it can hold them liable. I mean, yeah, great. I'm sure it's a great moneymaker if you want to sell it, but it's also very dangerous.
Chris, can I say something?
Is that Jack?
Jack Quirk, yes.
Yep. Well, do you have a question for Representative Roberts?
Yes. She brought up the idea, the definition of an independent, and it's common practice in our industry, no matter what, it's a dealership or an independent, that a lot of technicians that work for us and them, when they go home, they're working on their neighbor's vehicle or relatives or whatever. These people who are well versed in fixing automobiles can obviously do this at their garage at home. So if this data is going to be available to them at any time, like they can at an independent or a dealership, are they going to be required to carry insurance or be bonded or have some kind of protection? So if the data is not being used properly, that the consumer can be protected? You know, how is this entity going to protect the consumer if you have tens of thousands of these technicians in the state of Maine, you know, on a Saturday or a Sunday or in the evening after they've left work, which they do just about everywhere? How is this entity going to be able to control all this?
If that's a question from Mr. Quirk, thank you. For me, that's professional licensing. We do licensing to set standards, to protect consumers and to enforce regulations. So to me, that's a it's a license, just like an electrician or a plumber, not a contractor yet, but sorry, I had to throw that in there. But it's, to me, that's required, you know, education, continuing education, insurance, et cetera. I mean, the whole, we've got a standard of professional licenses.
But what I'm getting at is that, you know, most technicians have state inspection licenses where they can inspect a vehicle, which is brakes, you know, common things. But what happens if they're working on someone's airbag? Are they going to be required to have training? Certain radar information as far as, you know, the sonars and things that are on these vehicles? Are they just going to be able to get the information and just go for it? Or are they going to have to get education and prove to this entity that they're qualified for these things? You just can't, you know, take say a C technician and have them working on an airbag or taking part of transmission. They're not qualified for that. So how would the consumer be protected to make sure that the person that's getting this information can actually work on the vehicle?
In that instance, I don't see any way.
Christina?
How is it? I'm sorry, it's just a question. How is it done today? They work on airbags today.
He was talking about the data, sir.
Well, obviously, if a technician is going to work on an airbag or anything like that, if it's with a certain manufacturer, they go to school for that. That's where most of the technicians go. They go to school. It could be through one of the community colleges where they have a certificate, or they go to a manufacturing school or to a professional school. But I hope somewhere along the line, this entity is going to be responsible for making sure that the right person is working on the right product. That would be dangerous.
So let me just interrupt for a minute. I think we're going a little bit far afield here. I think that these are good questions, and I think they're questions that probably we're going to have to think about. But I'm just not sure if these are fair questions to be asking Representative Roberts. Certainly, Representative, if there's something that you want to add, but I really think this is probably more of a discussion that we should have among ourselves at some point after the hearing. Is that okay with everyone? All right. I think Christina does have a question for you, though.
Well, in fairness, Chris, it was on the same topic, and that was just kind of to bring this back to the data. Representative Roberts, do you think that, to your earlier point about defining who is an independent repair facility who would have access to the data, if the independent entity had rulemaking authority that spoke to which independent repair facilities would qualify for getting access to the data, and would that help satisfy some of these concerns about, can your next door neighbor get access to this data? Is that among the things that the independent entity can prescribe in rules?
I don't believe so, or we would not be haggling around what a contractor is in the legislature. So, I mean, that's not something that's prescribed by DPFR. Unless I'm mistaken, but I believe even just us trying to define that has been quite a hurdle.
I think I misunderstood an earlier comment then, because I thought you had said that one of the things that would be needed is a better definition of what's an independent.
Yeah, well, we
repair
just don't have
facility.
one in statute.
Yeah.
Like at all. I looked, unless it's like in one little paragraph somewhere.
Can the entity do that by rule? You don't think?
I don't think so,
Okay.
but you're, I mean.
Thank you.
I will defer to you.
Thank you. I'm sorry to prolong this conversation, Chris.
No. Any other questions for Representative Roberts? Yeah, Jeff.
I'd just like to follow up on her question. I think it's a great
Mhm.
question, but I mean, in the referendum language, it says the independent shall, and it lists several things, but one
Mhm.
of the things it says is create policies. So would it not be able to create a policy that would include a definition of independent repair?
So again, in my 6 years in the legislature, I am not aware, that doesn't mean there's not, I am not aware of a quasi or independent agency that has authority to do its own rulemaking, hold public hearings for rulemaking and all of that. It's, even if you look at FAME and everything like that, they come to me for a bill.
Okay, taking that answer for what it is, so then what authority then under the referendum language as it exists would this independent entity be able to do with respect to creation of policies?
I think recommend policies to the legislature.
Well, I mean, the language is create, not recommend. I'm just trying
Mm.
to figure out from your perspective what they would, by this statute, have the
Mm.
authority to do, in your opinion.
It's very unclear, and this is why when I read this, I said, this bill's, as we say, not fully baked.
Okay, one more time. I'm sorry, Representative Roberts.
Mm.
If the recommendation to the legislature
Mhm.
would be recommending a body somewhere that did have rulemaking authority,
Mhm.
such as some body nested within an existing state agency,
Mhm.
would that alleviate some of your concerns? Do you think that if such an entity had rulemaking authority,
Mhm.
putting aside what, has happened in the past with quasis and all that, do you think that this is the type of issue, the definition of what's an independent repair facility that should have access to the data,
Mhm.
that could be resolved in rulemaking?
On that definition, yes, I think that could. I would definitely think that wherever it should be housed, that conversation needs to happen with them.
And so do you think that the entity should have rulemaking authority wherever it's housed? Should it be housed somewhere that has rulemaking authority?
It's unclear to me what that rulemaking authority is, what the end result is for.
Okay. All right, thanks.
Any other questions for Representative Roberts? Tom?
The end result for was always to implement the law. You can't have car manufacturers creating their own system. So the idea of the entity was to make sure that the law was implemented for the best way for the consumer. Because that's what this whole thing is, an owner authorized application or information. So the owner authorizes who gets their information. Now, this entity was tasked to make sure that the Attorney General in the state of Maine and the legislature all knew that this law could be implemented. So in that light, is there anyone that you see that should be on this that would make it, maybe it's a cybersecurity person or it's a professional licensure person? The entity was really supposed to show ways it could be implemented. It was shown kind of at the last meeting of ways it could be implemented. So is there anyone besides, I know you didn't appreciate or agree with the fact that aftermarket and manufacturers were on this. Is there anyone else that specifically you think should be on this that could help implement this in the best way for the consumer?
I mean, I think there were a lot of people that we would have thought of to put on this. But again, this comes back to the language. If the independent entity's intent was to make sure the state enforces the law, like that's what we have government oversight for.
So
Because what you just said was the independent entity is tasked with making sure that the law is implemented by the state. Well, if it's the state's law, then we have government oversight and we have committees of jurisdiction that handle that. So that's a conversation over here.
So would it help, would you agree that the independent entity could be an advisory role to the Attorney General's office to make sure that the law is enforced?
As an advisory role, I mean, I don't think that could hurt. Again, in the version that was bipartisan we put forth, the entity wasn't in it. Because government, when functioning properly, does its job and protects consumers and supports businesses. They're not mutually exclusive.
Yes, Tim.
Hi, Representative Roberts. Just a few things, and I guess my question is, since there has to be a question, I reached out to you.
It's not like an official rule right here.
I guess my question is, would you make yourself available to meet with me at one of our shops so we can have a much longer conversation that we don't have time for today? Because I think based on your statement and this conversation, like we're 95% in violent agreement. There's 5% where I think the reality that we live repairing cars, I think there's some pieces of information that you and I could talk through and you could actually see real life examples. Because I think at the heart of the matter, you touched on this a little bit as well. And I'm largely to blame for this, I guess. We've kind of got, Maine is right here in the middle now of what's an industry dispute. But at the heart of that industry dispute, which I'd love to help you understand better, is consumer protection and consumer choice. And so as someone with 30 years in the business plus, I see that as a real threat. And I see the telematics and the remote access to data. And I'll just give you one little kind of layman's example that, and actually car manufacturers have backed off a little bit about this, but if you go back, right, you can find all kinds of information about heated seats becoming a subscription. You can find, look it up. It's a real thing. There was GM had a whole division around monetizing subscriptions for people in their cars. There's all kinds of industry people talking about how cars, this goes back a few years, cars are going to become like an iPhone. And they're looking at the car as a technology platform. So this is sort of the threat that those of us in the independent repair world saw. And then, one of the guys who works for me has a Mercedes-Benz that starts telling him on his dashboard where he needs to go for his repair. And that's built into the technology of the car. So these are all little pieces of information that we in the industry saw. That is why I believe at the heart of this matter is violent agreement with you that we need to protect consumers. I also have been in the industry and have, seen how when cars are 20, we all talk about cars and we think about these new cars and EVs and we think about cars with their first owner and what they're doing. They largely go back to great dealerships like Jack's and others, but these cars have to be repaired when they're 20, 25 years old. The average car on the road is 13 years old, which means over half of the cars are older than 13 years, right? So you have low-income consumers who are now a fourth or fifth owner of a vehicle, and they've got to keep it running, and they're typically low income. So part of my, I guess, perspective to this is how do we protect these consumers from what I believe was car manufacturers seeing themselves more as technology companies and trying to create ecosystems that force people, like we all have to go to an Apple store to get our phone repaired. That was the threat that I believe this bill with the remote access and telematics is intended to fight against. And so once again, my question is, can we set up a time that you and I can go have a longer conversation?
Absolutely. And I do appreciate kind of taking the temperature down as opposed to previous things. And yeah, I think when I replied,
I think one of your kids got COVID. We were going to meet in
you were out of the
Sanford.
country.
You're in South Berwick or something. We were going to meet in
Yes,
Sanford. Yeah.
Yes. I'm not going to speak for her, but I would assume that my lead would also be interested.
I'll host anybody who wants to come.
Field trip.
All right, any other questions
Not
for
a quorum,
Representative Roberts?
though.
All right, thank you for the marathon session.
Keep 'em busy.
I think that'll be a tough act to follow. Good afternoon, members of the Right to Repair Working Group. My name is Amanda Collimore, and I have the distinct honor of serving as state representative for House District 68, which is Pittsfield, Clinton, Burnham, and Troy. I also serve as the ranking member on the Joint Standing Committee on Innovation, Development, Economic Advancement, and Business. I come before you today with my observations, concerns, and thoughts about the entity addressed in this bill creating the working group and in the Maine state statute passed in 2023. I have physically attended all but one of these meetings. I was away for a conference during the last meeting, but I have watched the recording. The conference was very timely given the concerns I and my constituents have surrounding the data accessed and the current law gives this entity. I have many questions that I will ask throughout my statement, but I'm not asking you to answer those questions today, to simply keep them as reference as you continue your work and discussions. Many of these questions come directly from the people that I represent. We've been directed to keep our comments only to the entity and how we believe it should be formed and the business it conducts. However, to talk about the entity without mentioning the right to repair law is impracticable. According to the law, the entity has power over my vehicle-generated data in Section 2 of Title 29A, Chapter 2, Section 1810. It states that the independent entity shall manage cybersecure access to monitor vehicle-generated data, including ensuring on an ongoing basis that access to onboard diagnostic system and standardized access platform is secure based on all applicable implementation of this section and relevant provisions of this section, the United States and international standards, and that they shall identify and adopt relevant standards for implementation, monitor and develop policies for evolving use and availability of data generated by motor vehicles, and create policies for compliance with relevant laws, regulations, standards, technology, and best practices. In subsection 6, the law goes on to describe equipment that manufacturers of motor vehicles are required to equip all vehicles with. This platform, as described in statute, must be available through a mobile-based app and directly accessible by an independent repair facility or licensed dealer for purposes of maintaining, diagnosing, and repairing motor vehicles. All parts, tools, software, and other components necessary to complete the full repair of the vehicle must be included and provided. Lastly, the law describes the enforcement mechanisms in subsection 8 that the entity notifies it's very prescriptive, that the entity notifies the AG's office shall promptly institute any actions, and the independent entity through the AG may apply to the Superior Court of any county of the state to enforce lawful order or action by the independent entity. As you can see by the makeup of the entity discussed in the working group is fully tied to the language of the law passed in 2023. You cannot discuss one without the other. The entity, in whatever shape it may take in the future, is fully in charge of the access and use of our vehicle-generated data as it's stated in statute currently. This brings up many concerns. We've heard a lot about intent throughout the conversation about this entity, especially in the first 3 meetings. With that in mind, I think it's also important to express the intent of LD 2289, the legislation that created this working group. As a member of the committee that voted for this legislation and asked my colleagues to support it, I want to clarify my intent. First, the goal of this legislation was to keep the conversation going on the right to repair and how it looks in Maine. This bill was to pass to allow us to continue to look at what an entity, if any, looked like or needed to look like because another bill in our committee removed the term independent entity. The intent was to see if an independent entity was the way to go for enforcement, or if there was another way or type of entity to enforce the law. I have many concerns about cybersecurity when having an unregulated independent entity access or control my data, any data, repair or otherwise. When looking at the makeup of the entity currently written into law, there are actually no cybersecurity experts on that committee. So my first question is, how will we, the Maine consumer, be protected from the entity's access to our data? At the last meeting, we heard a voicemail played by Parker Swift saying that the dealership he purchased his vehicle from had received a notification through his OnStar system that he was due for an oil change. Though we lost the end of the message because Mr. Swift began talking before it finished, I'm assuming he was being asked if he wanted to make an appointment for an oil change. Mr. Swift said that the dealership shouldn't be the only one able to make that call to him, that his independent repair shop should be able to do that too. The thing is, when you purchase a vehicle from a dealership, you enter into an agreement or partnership of sort. When I purchased my car 6 years ago, I signed documents giving permission for the dealership to contact me about service reminders. I, as the consumer, also have the ability to remove that contact. I no longer have that partnership with the dealership I chose because I did not want to keep receiving phone calls. I thought they were annoying, and I don't travel that way for work much. I didn't purchase my car from them because I planned to have it serviced there. I bought it from them because it was the best deal for the purchase and my trade. I made that choice. My next set of questions come here. When looking at leveling the playing field mindset, who are we leveling it for? Are we saying that a consumer who receives a phone call from a dealership they established a relationship with is not capable of thanking them for the reminder and turning down the request of an appointment and making that appointment with their preferred mechanic for service? Or are we saying, as Mr. Swift implied, that we are preferring to level the playing field to allow places like VIP at the table here, AutoZone, O'Reilly, Quirk, or others to also be able to view our OnStar data and give us the same call? Wouldn't this type of access go against the cybersecurity recommendations we heard from Brian Romansky and Mike Tanner at the last meeting? How am I able to give an OAuth 2 limited lifetime token to protect my data and also provide unlimited access for them to call if there were a problem or my mileage is approaching an oil change limit? This is a question of security for Mainer's data and who has access to it. The current law gives access to all telematic data that can relate to repair and diagnosis. We need to ensure that we have guardrails built into the law so that we can protect our data and not make it easier for groups to access it. Some of you may already know that I work for the University of Maine in a research lab. That lab I work in has restricted access because we have research projects that are funded by the federal government. In order to walk in the front door of our building, I have to have a background check. You would have to have a background check. That is true even if you're only coming into the front lobby conference room for a meeting or going into my office, which is an unrestricted area. The level of security keeps out bad actors and keeps our secure information safe. To access my email, whether I'm in the lab or working remotely, I have dual authentication platforms that I have to use. I have Google for my maine.edu email address and another for my secure email through the lab. I have all of this, even though the grant that I'm funded by and have been funded by for the over 6 years requires public access. All of this to say that I understand the importance of security, cyber and physical, and am concerned that we do not have enough clear guidelines in the current law to protect vehicle-generated data and the physical safety of Mainer's vehicles. I would ask this working group to seriously consider statutory language changes when discussing the potential entity and that may oversee and enforce this law. We can't do this only by rulemaking. This will set clear limitations for access by the entity and repair shops to protect the people of Maine. In the last meeting, Mr. Tanner of ACA said it very well. Technology defining policy is the wrong way to go about it. We have a law that is heavily focused on a technology, the standardized platform, that an independent entity would enforce the compliance of for vehicles having telematics on board. If this isn't an instance of technology defining policy, I don't know what is. With that in mind, I asked this working group to look at what the standardized platform is defined as in statute. Currently, it's defined as a mobile app. Is that what we should be confining it to? What does it have access to? Should it be fully remote accessed so that you can diagnose and repair anything that's the same as when it's tethered, which is currently what the law says? Or, as Mr. Romansky suggested, should it have reasonable safety and security written restrictions defined in statute? Though I certainly cannot speak for any of you, I don't believe that anyone on this working group believes that someone should have remote access to my braking system. That is a huge safety concern. Now, I'd like to come back to cybersecurity concerns that this all centers around. Throughout all of your discussions, I hope the important question, thought, point, whatever it is that you're focusing on, is not leveling the playing field. The law already does that. I hope that that goes back to whether or not this is to protect Mainers. I hope your main focus is on keeping Mainers' vehicle-generated data and their vehicles safe and secure. In listening to Voight Rich's talk during the last meeting, he brought up a very interesting and I think helpful solution to ensure we protect Maine citizens from cybersecurity and safety-related telematic disruptions, FBI background checks. If the intent of the current law is only to level the playing field and not restrict and not harm vehicle owners or sell their data, then it makes complete sense that part of the registry process mentioned in Mr. Romansky's presentation and others throughout the last 4 meetings is that a background check should be required. An FBI background check is very thorough and would ensure things, but there could be other types of background checks. They do exist. If I'm required to do it to enter a part of a building that has public access required, then I don't think it's unreasonable to ask our mechanics that would have access to our telematics to have that as well. Since we're going down that route of having trainings, background checks to protect Mainers, it's also important to note, given my 4 years of experience on the IDEA B committee, that the entity you're discussing may not, in fact, be an independent entity as described in law. It may actually be a licensing board, which was brought up by Representative Roberts as well in the questions. We've heard a bill about leveling the playing field for businesses. What better way to do that? To ensure that all mechanics working on telematic diagnostics repairs have the same training and background checks. This will ensure all Mainers are able to feel more secure with repairers accessing their data. That includes dealerships too. We've heard from Mr. Quirk that they are also considered independent repair shops because they work on vehicles outside of their certified sales brands. Maybe you only require the license for people who are looking to do telematic data repair. Maybe the license is also for others who would access the OBD report. That I leave up to you to discuss. The last comment I will make about this is access. I'll mention the leveling the playing field phrase that we continue to hear throughout our discussions, even though that has to do more with whether or not the bill is needed and not about the entity itself. The entity, if any, is in control of all of that data according to how the statute is currently written. So I would ask, finally, that this committee also consider ensuring that our constituents, the people of Maine, have the option to opt out of such diagnostic connectivity. We do not have any language currently in law that does that. This would help my constituents who are reaching out to me and asking if they can turn off their telematics because they don't want anybody to access anything ever. If they had the option, they would buy a fully mechanical vehicle that had absolutely no telematics so that they can drive back and forth to work. And I can tell you right now, that is not an option. We keep hearing that nonstop. Telematics are in every single vehicle we buy. So let's give our Mainers a true choice to also opt out of having anybody have access to that as well. So that I can go to my car parked out into the parking lot now, disconnect it, and not fail a vehicle inspection, which currently is not clear whether or not if you disconnect your telematics would allow you to pass a vehicle inspection in the state of Maine. This would give us clear guidance in statute. So it would also allow, if I were to purchase my vehicle in New Hampshire, for example, which does not have this current law, that I would not then come into Maine to try to register my vehicle and get a call from the dealership saying that I now have to have this platform installed on my vehicle because I have a vehicle registered in Maine, which is also unclear whether or not that would be required. I thank you very much for taking the time to listen to me. I know that I went a little over. I apologize. I am very passionate about this issue, and I am happy to answer any questions you may have.
Well, thank you, Representative Collmore. Yes, we use the legislation. Legislators don't get time to rule for you as well. Are there any questions for Representative Collmore?
This is Brian Boggs. I have a question.
Yeah, Brian, go ahead.
You mentioned that the law creates a level playing field. And based on your reading of the law, do you agree that all of the following are already covered and mandated within the law, creating a level playing field without the section mentioning the independent entity, meaning that all of the following items don't actually require the independent entity? So one, that manufacturers must make repair and maintenance information available. That two, that manufacturers must sell their scan tools to independent repairers. That three, manufacturers must offer their scan tools and the repair and maintenance information at fair and reasonable prices. That four, manufacturers must empower other scan tool providers to make their own scan tools. Five, the manufacturers must make the same telematics information available to independent repairers that they make available to dealerships. And six, that there's monitoring and enforcement mechanisms to ensure compliance with these statutory mandates through the existing government oversight via the Attorney General. That essentially, do you agree the law, without mentioning the portion around the independent entity, that all six of these items which help create a level playing field are already covered?
Yes, I do believe that the law without the entity does create a situation where that's already required and enforceable. We have laws in place and the laws get enforced, whether by the AG's office or I don't really see the need for another entity to be trying to enforce laws and telling the AG's office whether or not they should enforce laws. So yes, I agree that that's already enforceable under law without having an independent entity.
Other questions? Yeah, Jeff?
You spent some time reading verbatim from section 2 of the referendum language independent entity, but I noticed that you stopped before subsections A, B, and C. So those sections say the independent entity shall, and I won't read them all, but it says identify and adopt relevant standards, that's A. B, monitor and develop policies. C, create policies for compliance. How do you juxtapose that language with the language that you read?
So actually, that was all written on my paper, but I know I have a time limit. And so instead of reading that part verbatim, I just summarized it after. I still have all of the notes here. I know exactly what you're talking about. And as with Representative Roberts, I have never seen an independent entity that's allowed to create policy that requires the state of Maine to follow said policies. And I'm not sure exactly how you're framing the question with this, but it does create, your question alone creates a great issue and question as to what we were asking. How does that first part coalesce with the second part? Because they almost feel like they contradict each other, but complement each other, but they could contradict. But what does it mean by access? Does it mean full access? Does that mean they control the data? There was a lot because it's manage and access, identify and adopt, monitor and develop, create policies for compliance. And that's a great question and one that we weren't able to get an answer for.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out that the specific language that gives authority under this particular section to the independent entity all talks about identifying, adopting, monitoring, developing policies, not making databases, not controlling data. And so I just wanted to call that out to make sure I understood what your position was with respect to that, since you only read the top section of the language. So thank you.
Yeah, not a problem. And I think the word of concern is manage cyber secure access. That's the phrase in that section that attaches to all of those A, B, and C things. Manage cyber secure access, shall manage cyber secure access. So there's not an option. They must manage that.
So in the management of cyber secure access, if it was required for the car owner, the vehicle owner, to manage that access by consenting to access and to the level of access and the timing by which access would be granted, would that go down the road to solving the privacy issues that I heard from you and from Representative Roberts?
Could you say that one more time for me?
Yeah, my question is, I'll try to do a better job in asking it. if you're giving the consumer, because it really is, we agree about the consumer, you're giving the consumer the right to make that choice. Who am I going to give this information to, and for how long, and for what specific information, or for what specific reason? Is it to repair my brakes? Your example. If the consumer, the car owner, has that ability, does that go a long way down the road to answering your privacy concerns because they're granting the access themselves?
I think that comes to the real core of the issue. The consumer should have control, period. And but we do have control. I can remove access anytime I want to my dealership. I can go when I get an alert, if I have an app that gives an alert. I prefer not to do the subscription status that Mr. Winkler brought up on my vehicle. But I drive down the road, my local mechanic, I can walk to. And so I have that choice now currently to have that access or suspend said access.
Do you know whether or not your trip down to the dealership to do that means that you simply stop getting notifications and communications? Or does it mean that the manufacturer will agree with your wishes that you don't want the manufacturer to get any of that data? And so it stops the flow of data. So the manufacturer can no longer get that data. So it can't send you those messages. In other words, are they still collecting information about you? Do you know?
Oh, I'm sure they are still collecting information because unfortunately, the United States does not follow the same privacy laws as the European privacy laws. So that's a totally different, separate issue that comes off of, I mean, you've got a phone sitting there right next to you. That is nonstop listening to you and collecting data. So if we're going to go down that route, that's a whole different working group that has absolutely nothing to do with whether or not I can have access to my vehicle data.
I completely agree. We have deviated well beyond discussion of the entity. But you've raised those issues. And so I wanted to explore a little bit of why you feel the way you feel. So I appreciate you answering my questions.
Not a problem.
Other questions for Representative Cullimore? Yeah, Tom?
I appreciate the telematics from folks shutting off the system. That's something I think we can't put that back. I think the manufacturer would be the only one that can help you shut off a telematics system in these vehicles. You talked about the dealer and being able to shut off any alerts that come from the dealers. Do you know that can you grant any access to an independent repairer to reach out to you about maintenance options?
If that option is there, I don't want it. Because again, I don't want the phone calls. I get mailers. I'm on a do not call list. I'm on the national do not call list, national do not mail list. I feel like most people that I talk to about this, they don't want those phone calls either. My car has a system set up that tells me that I'm due for an oil change, or I have a sticker up here. I tend to go to Prompto because I can just go in, drive in, 15-minute oil change, leave. Sometimes there's a line because a lot of people feel that way about a quick Prompto oil change, but I don't want anybody to have that access. And the people that I'm hearing from don't want anybody to have that access. So what they do want is that choice. They do have that choice. When I was getting those phone calls from the dealership, whose name I won't mention, from that dealership saying, hey, we noticed that in your Hyundai, you're due for an oil change. I would say, thanks for the reminder. I'll go to Prompto. They're not forcing me to come to them for that change. I have never once received a phone call that my ABS system was breaking down when it was breaking down. I've not once received a phone call saying that my brake pads needed to be replaced, or when my tire punctured. I didn't get a phone call about that when I allowed that access. So the only thing that we get phone calls on, and what I've heard from my constituents, is the oil change thing right now. And I know you have a lot of concerns about what the future looks like. I have a lot of concerns about that. And it isn't just to do with the telematic access. But when we're talking about an entity whose mandate is to manage cybersecurity access, my concern is who's managing the entity? And should they actually be independent? And what training is going in to ensure that they, on managing that access, have the correct training and understanding of what it means to be cyber secure and keep me and other Mainers safe so that we don't have an iRobot type situation where everybody's cars are taken over.
So I think, just to follow up on that, I think it's really important that in the language as written, it is owner authorized. So if you wanted to share your information with no one, that's up to you. If you want to share it to Mr. Winkler and VIP, you can do that. You can shut that off when you want. That is kind of the intent behind the bill and as written in that section. When it comes to the independent entity, we've always saw that as I said, as a way to show ways to implement the law, to keep folks honest. And advise the Attorney General's office. Is there anyone specifically that you'd like to see on this entity? I know you talked about cybersecurity. Do you think the entity could get into what the manufacturers are collecting and what they're sharing and selling, perhaps prohibiting something of that? Or is there someone specific on that you want to put on this entity?
I think as for somebody who's on the entity, I do think that it's very concerning that the law does not require a cybersecurity specialist. I don't understand why that wasn't included on the list when that law was written, given that there's a shall manage cyber secure access on that entity. As for the independent status of that entity, it's, I don't believe it should be independent. I don't believe that it's just an advisory. When you have something saying, create policies for compliance, that is legislative. That is statutory. That is real rulemaking. And that needs to fall under the guidance of protection that has public access so that consumers can, when they hear about a new rule being made, can come and have a public hearing in a committee room where they can say, I don't like that, or these are my concerns, or that particular public comment that's required by law of all state agencies.
Just a last follow-up. So we talked a lot about where this entity would live if it was going to be independent or part of the Attorney General's office, Secretary of State. So do you have any opinions on where something like this should live? I know you said not to be independent, but if it were to be an advisory role. So one of the ways I think we'd see it is that if a lot of customers weren't able to share their information with an independent repairer for, say, just Nissan, for example, there would have to be the Attorney General would have to perhaps convene this entity or convene this working group to get into how and why Nissan is not complying with the law. Do you see a home for where this would live, or do you kind of think that this should be something the Attorney General should pursue without any independent experts in this?
I think that's a good question. Currently, how the law is written, and again, we are not being directed to change the law underneath this working group, though I think statutory language options could be explored as a recommendation to the committee with jurisdiction. That is where you'd have to make some of those changes, because currently written in law, it's not an advisory board. And though I would fully support, and I'm sure the Attorney General's office would fully support having experts that they could confide in, that is not how the current law is written. And so you would have to explore statutory language changes to turn it into an advisory board. And then, yes, if it's just an advisory board giving advice to the AG's office about what they can pursue, then AG's office makes sense. If it stays as written in law and managing cyber secure access, then it's a licensing board that belongs in OPOR.
So if we just simply added something at the end saying that this entity shall be at the discretion of the Attorney General's office, so you could create all these policies and standards and monitor for issues, but it was at the discretion of the Attorney General, would that be something you'd be comfortable with?
I don't think it's just adding a sentence on the end. I think it's redefining what that entity is, because it's very clear in the definition on managing, accessing, creating those policy and stuff. It should be redefined as, if that's the way that you are looking to go with this entity, it needs to be redefined throughout Section 2 as what the independent entity is, does, and what their clear rules are. We do that for licensing boards all the time. They have very strict, confined rules on how they operate. And if this was operating as an advisory board, I want that to be very clear in statute as well. So if if you were to make those changes, that is something that I would love to see come before our committee for discussion so that the public can hear more about that as well. Yes.
Thank you.
Other questions? Representative Calmer, I just want to ask you about, you mentioned FBI background checks. And are you suggesting that we should think about background checks being required not just for independent repair entities, but anyone who is going to be handling cyber data or telematic data? In other words, even if it's at a dealership?
Right. So it wouldn't only be independent. And as we heard from Mr. Quirk, they are also, because we don't have a clear definition of what an independent repair shop is, they would also be one because they work on, I go to Quirk Hyundai for my vehicle, but I also see Ford, Chevy, all of that. So they would also be, I'm assuming, wanting to upgrade to that telematic access. So they would have to be required to have that as well. That would be a true level playing field. Everybody's required to do that. Now, if they're only accessing it through the tethered OBD thing when you're in the thing, do they need that? I don't know. That would be a different discussion and not about the telematics that this bill and this entity would be enforcing.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, Tim?
I guess just one last comment, actually, kind of to that point. One of the things I personally think, and I mentioned this when Representative Roberts was up here, is the $80,000 BMW today is going to be an $8,000 fourth owner, fifth owner BMW in 20 years. We have to remember, this isn't just about, quote, independent repair companies. This is also about people who own old cars and need to fix them themselves. And today we see it's a small number of cars today because, first of all, we don't see cars for a few years because most of them go back to dealerships. So our sweet spot is like 6 to 15-year-old cars, right? And 20-year-old cars, people work on themselves. 4-year-old newer, for the most part, go to the dealership. And, that's a generality, but that's kind of in summary. One of the things that I think the entity we need to think about is how these cars that are produced today, that we have cars today, we have to go to the dealership because the brakes have some sort of connection to the ECM, the computer controlled. Oftentimes we can do it through the OBD2, but once again, in layman's terms, what I see happening more and more with the newer cars, especially the EVs, is they're sort of, virtualizing the OBD. So you can't necessarily get to everything from the onboard port. And that's the kind of stuff that concerns me for Maine consumers 30 years from now when a car is that old and somebody needs to fix it themselves. And are they going to have to go get a license themselves to go do a brake job on their BMW? These are just the kind of things of the real world of fixing cars that I think we all have to keep in mind when we start. Because I'm a firm believer and agree with, like, we do background checks at, today for all of our employees. We have automotive certification programs that dealerships and us and all of us use to certify people to do certain types of jobs. So those kinds of conversations I think are natural for something like this. But that doesn't exist today for the guy or the girl who owns their 25, 30-year-old car and fixes it in their driveway. And so we have to be careful not to have regulations that suddenly turn that into something that can't be done in the future as these cars get harder and harder to deal with technology-wise, especially if there is no ability to have the same remote access that a Tesla or a GM or somebody has to their new vehicles today. And I don't believe engineers who build these vehicles that are selling today think about how's a do-it-yourselfer going to fix it in 25 years. That's the perspective I guess I'm trying to make sure we all keep in mind as well.
No, I agree completely with that. And just like with licensure, we look at, like, I can do my own electrical work in my house. We have allotments in statute that allow those. And that would absolutely, if it's your own vehicle, then absolutely you should be able to do. That's the whole point of right to repair, right? Is
right.
I was underneath my vehicle just 4 weeks ago working on my ABS system,
right,
because I was having an error that kept popping up. Eventually, I ended up bringing it to the dealership because when I replaced the ABS things. It didn't work. I went in and it was because I had a little gear that I couldn't see that had a crack in it and it kept seeing that on the camera and was engaging my ABS every time I pressed the brake. But I still currently, I have that ability to do that. I can go under my vehicle right now and change that cable out. I bought my part online because it was the cheapest place to buy it. You talk about cost. That isn't just a low income, as you had mentioned with Representative Roberts. I would be considered middle income right
Sure.
now, and I can't afford to pay what I would like to be able to pay to have somebody certified to work on my Hyundai do it
Right.
until it comes to the point where I can no longer diagnose
Right.
it because I'm not a mechanic.
And I'm in agreement with you. What I'm afraid of, once again, though, is that the newest cars have technology that will prevent that. That's what I think is the reality of what we're seeing in some of these newest cars. So you say we have that ability and we can sort of legally say, well, if you're at your own home, you can do this. And if it's your own car in your own driveway, you can do this. But if the car manufacturer has architected the technology to prevent you from doing that, that's my concern, is that today's car, you might be able to do that, but you might not be able to do that because the technology in the vehicle itself is going to prevent that car owner from doing it. That's where I think that, and I guess somewhat related to that is one last point, is having been in this industry and everything, and many people probably are aware of the fact that, this fight started in 2012 in Massachusetts with the first ballot initiative. Then we had this memorandum of understanding in 2013, right? The reality in the street today is there are still car manufacturers for certain models, certain pieces of information that we can't get to on the car. There are violations to that memorandum of understanding that I can find just by spending a day in one of our shops. So because that wasn't a law, that was a memorandum of understanding, right? And for the most part, it worked. And we're not a company, and neither is most independent repairers. We're not going to go sue GM or sue Chrysler or FCA or Stellantis or whatever they're called today, right? We're not. The independent repairers is an extremely fragmented part of the world, and the manufacturers are a small number of huge organizations. The idea that somehow, well, if there's a manufacturer who doesn't behave and doesn't follow the law, that there are ways to deal with that, you're not going to have repairers go sue car manufacturers. That's just not we have to be careful not to just assume, well, they can just pursue legal action. That just doesn't happen. So I don't know that that's a feasible solution. I believe that for that reason, the conversations we're having about it being housed within the Attorney General's office and there being more teeth to this regulation, and actually having something that car manufacturers believe does have much more enforceability than the memorandum of understanding today, including remote access. That, to me, that's the heart of the matter here, is how do we do those things so that we protect these consumers, independent repair shops and consumers, like I said, tomorrow and 20 years from now.
I don't disagree with that. And I do believe that it's important that we make sure that you, my son, his children, when he has them, are all able to have the same right to work on their cars that I have right now and the ability to do so. Now, I feel like with the way technology is going, as a lay person who isn't an engineer, I'm probably less likely to touch a newer vehicle in my driveway because I will probably fry something. I'm not an engineer. I'm not an electrician. I don't understand a lot of the relays. I can look it up online. We heard last meeting a lot about being able to find those wiring diagrams online, but I personally choose not to do that. Somebody who might be able to do that, sure, they should have that ability. But is the state of Maine going to do that? I love our state. Our state is awesome. Our motto, I lead, love that motto. We are a very tiny state. Are we going to force GM, Tesla, whatever the Dodge version is now, are we going to force them with a $10,000, $20,000 fine that is pocket change to them to follow this law by having an independent entity? I don't think we will. It's a great lofty goal, beautiful, but that's a national issue. That's an international issue because a lot of these cars are not made here. And so how do I force a German company to follow these laws in the state of Maine only? And so that's another thing to keep in mind when we're talking about what this entity is and what they look like. Are they an advisory role? Is the AG's office actually going to force Mercedes-Benz to follow a rule when they can just pay $2,000 or $20,000 and move on? So those are just things to consider. I love the beautiful view where we can all work on our cars, but I also have a realistic view of most of us are not going to be able to as they continue to come more. And we will have to rely on places like AutoZone, Napa, VIP to do those repairs. But what protects us from them from price gouging the way the dealerships do? And so we have a lot of issues that go under this, but under the current law, having that statement of managing cybersecure access is my biggest point of concern. And the constituents that I talk to, they had no idea when they voted for the right to repair. Everybody wants the right to repair. They had no idea that they were voting for that particular line. And like Representative Roberts, I was geofenced when we were working on LD 1911, and every single person I called back, I didn't even have two people who disagreed and wanted the law the same. All 100 plus people who called me said they agreed that that should be removed.
Other questions? All right, seeing none, thank you very much.
Thank you. Good luck.
All right, is there anyone else in the room who would like to offer testimony? All right, seeing none, what I'm going to ask now is if there's anyone on Zoom who wants to testify, they should now raise their electronic hand. And then Katrina, let me know, are there people who are raising their hands? No. All right, I'm just going to give a couple more minutes in case people, minute or so in case people are just figuring out where the button is. All right, looks like we do have someone, Katrina. All right, so I can't quite read the name, but it looks like David Tribbing. All right,
Yes.
Thank you very much for joining us. Why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself and then go ahead and offer your testimony.
Thank you very much. This has been a fascinating, important, and interesting discussion on the whole right to repair topic and data access. I'm David Trebbing. I'm in charge of external affairs for Daimler Truck North America. Daimler Truck is the largest manufacturer of medium and heavy duty trucks. We have 40% of the market share through our Freightliner and Western Star brands. And one of the things which I wanted to make sure, as you look at options roles for the independent entity, is that you keep in mind, I know we have representatives from the auto industry involved in this discussion, but the law, the way it's written, the way the referendum was passed, it also impacts medium and heavy duty trucks. And we are very, very different, not just in terms of how they're built or how they're serviced or how they're used, but we're not simply large cars. And that's one thing I want to encourage the panel and the legislators as they look at the role, the responsibilities of this independent entity, to keep in mind the trucks are very, very different, but we are subject to this the law. Trucks, essentially, there's no vertical integration in the commercial truck industry, the commercial truck business. Trucks are built for specific purposes, and we essentially assemble the vehicles based on the customer's requirements and specifications. And we assemble them from components from many, many independent manufacturers. Again, there's no vertical integration in the truck market the way there is in the car market. So when we look at telematics systems, for example, it's entirely possible that a commercial truck will have a Cummins engine, which has a proprietary diagnostic system which transmits independent data to the Cummins repair facilities. But because it's in a Freightliner truck, and we, the way the law is written, are listed as the entity responsible for providing the data, we don't have access to it because we don't make the engine. So long way around, as you look at the role for the independent entity and the responsibilities, that the directives coming out of it, the interaction with industry, just please keep in mind the trucks are not simply large cars. We are completely different. And also the data that's being collected, the purpose that it's being collected for fleet management systems, for performance information, we're not monetizing the data. This is something to improve the safety of the roads in Maine, to improve the safe performance of the vehicle, and to improve fleet management. Because 75% of all goods and services travel by truck. So we have a vested interest in making sure the roads are safe. And please just remember the trucks are not cars.
Thank you very much. Any questions? All right, I don't see any, so thank you very much for offering your comments.
Thank you.
I think at least one or two other people raised their hands. All right, looks like Aaron Lowe has joined us. Can you hear us?
Yes, can you hear me?
We can hear you just fine. If you could just go ahead and introduce yourself and then offer us your comments.
Sure, it's Aaron Lowe, and Aaron Lowe. I'm a consultant with the Coalition for Auto Repair Equality. In my former life, I was Senior Vice President for Government Affairs for the Auto Care Association for over 40 years. In that time, I've been involved with the right to repair issue from the beginning, I guess. It's important to note this really began with the Clean Air Act, when right to repair really came into place, when an amendment was passed in Congress that required the standardized onboard diagnostic port, and that any service information related to the emission system had to be provided to anybody repairing cars. At that time, the car companies fought this tooth and nail, and saying that there's no way the independents could handle working on emission systems. And we were able to beat that back, and it did pass. Since that time, the car companies have now said they support right to repair, which is great. But then following that, you go through the years, and in we go to Massachusetts, where they fought us tooth and nail in 2012 for the right to repair. And then that passed, and they claimed that it would create all kinds of issues in intellectual property. And it never came to be. And the right to repair was now claimed to be supported by the motor vehicle manufacturers. So we have many years where the car companies said they couldn't do it, and have always been able to do it and create a better consumer landscape by doing that. And I want to point to an example of a very similar issue to what we're talking about with the Right to Repair group, with this task force. Back in 2005 or 2006, I can't remember the exact date, California passed a law that required that anti-theft codes required to reset immobilizer systems be provided to locksmiths and independent repair entities. Car companies fought that in the state legislature in California. It did pass. They said that it would create all kinds of theft problems. What happened was the car companies got together with the locksmiths and the independent aftermarket and created a system called the Secure Data Release Model. And what that system does is allows anti-theft codes to be shared by the manufacturer with independent locksmiths and independent shops. It sets policies for what those shops have to meet, including background checks. And it created a group that monitors that and implements it. So given the requirements in this law, the manufacturers have found a way to work together with the independent aftermarket and with locksmiths to actually make that happen. And I think similar circumstances can be done with the entity that we're talking about now. It's not that the manufacturers can't do it. It's that they can do it, they just don't want to do it. And if you look at a lot of the example that was provided at the last meeting, showing how it could be done, there are international standards that have been put in place that will allow data to be shared cybersecurely. So I think we need to not look at all the ways that this can't be done. There are ways that it can be done, and there are cooperative ways that the industry can work together to put the system in place that will allow cybersecure access to data and allow consumers to control that data and still get their cars repaired competitively. So I just wanted to bring that perspective to this discussion, because I think we spent a lot of time showing where there are issues that it can't be done. And I think we've shown over the years that working together, and I have a lot of faith in the car company engineers and with the aftermarket engineers. And, you know, cybersecurity experts were not part of the original SDRM, but they were contracted with and worked with the group to put those in place. So I think there's a lot of room here that can make this happen in a way that's actually going to improve the cybersecurity situation for vehicles today. Thank you for the time, and I appreciate the opportunity to testify.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions for Mr. Lowe? All right, seeing none, thank you again.
Sure, thank you.
Anyone else, Katrina? All right, I'm just going to make a final call. If there's anyone on Zoom who wants to provide testimony to the working group, please raise your electronic hand. All right, I think this will conclude then the public hearing portion of the meeting. All right, so it's almost 4 o'clock, and I guess I'm interested to hear thoughts from the group about, you know, I don't know if there's anything more we want to do today, but if not, I think we should probably talk about what our next meeting is going to look like. I think it probably is getting close to time, if not the time, for us to really start having a dialogue among ourselves about how to put together some recommendations. And so I don't know if it makes sense to start that now, or for people to sort of digest what we've heard today and come to the next meeting ready to talk about those issues. I guess I'm just looking for any thoughts that any members of the group have about what they sort of see as the timing and the next steps. Yeah, Tim?
I do have something that I need to get to, so I can't stay too much longer today if for process purposes. So I think you're exactly right. I guess from having also not been able to be present for the first couple meetings, there was a lot today that I want to go back and contemplate or whatever, and come ready on the 30th to start hammering through some of the things you're talking about.
All right, thanks. Anyone else have any thoughts they want to offer? Yeah, Elizabeth?
Yeah, I'll just say that while I don't have anywhere to be, I think that it would make sense to come back at next meeting and start from the top of the hour kind of thing, because I suspect it'll be a lot to unpack. So I think that makes good sense.
All right, I think unless there's anyone who objects, I think it probably makes sense to wrap things up. And I think our next meeting, the only real agenda item is just going to be a discussion. You know, maybe at that point we start putting pen to paper. If not at that meeting, I think, you know, we do start thinking about putting together our report and what the report's going to look like. I guess just one comment I just want to offer for maybe people to think about, and I think it's something that Brian sort of flagged, and I've been thinking a lot about it. And so maybe it's just something that we can be thinking about until our next meeting, and then talk about at that point is to a large extent, the statute really does sort of seem self-effectuating. It imposes a bunch of requirements on manufacturers in terms of what and how they have to provide access to vehicle data. And so it's really never been completely clear to me what the independent entity's role is supposed to be. I think the only, and I might be wrong, but the only real reference I see sort of substantively to the independent entity in the statute is that I think there's a provision that says that that when a manufacturer is providing access, it can't be a system that requires prior authorization from the manufacturer unless the manufacturer does it in connection with standards that have been adopted by the independent entity. So it does seem like maybe the independent entity is supposed to have some role in sort of a system that requires prior authorization, but a lot of the rest of the statute really doesn't seem to need an independent entity. And so I do think it might be helpful for us to discuss a little bit at our next meeting, just exactly like what it is this independent entity is supposed to be doing. And I think that might sort of shape our discussion after that. But that's just sort of my thought for whatever it's worth. But it is something I've been thinking a lot about, that it's really never been clear to me what this independent entity is supposed to be doing, given that the statute does have a lot of substantive requirements that are baked right into it. So let me, I'll stop there. Are there any other comments people want to make, or should we just adjourn to our next meeting?
I know we have October 30th, I believe is the next meeting. And are we going to continue in that 2-week cycle, kind of see how it goes October 30th and go from there, just to get kind of, because with February, I believe, is a report due. I don't know if the AG's office had a timeline for when they wanted to stop having the meeting so you could write the report up or something like that.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I guess I'm curious what members think. I'd sort of be inclined to schedule another meeting for 2 weeks after our next upcoming one. I feel like maybe just having them every 2 weeks until we feel that we've made enough progress that maybe at that point we could back off a little bit. But if folks are willing, and I know it's a lot of work, and I really appreciate all the effort that people are taking to get to these meetings, whether in person or by Zoom, because even by Zoom, it's a big time investment. But if folks are willing, I think I would like to keep us on a 2-week schedule. Is that acceptable to folks? Okay, so I'll do the usual. We'll send out an email this week to propose a few different dates for our, I guess that'd be our 6th. This is our 4th meeting. Our 5th meeting is October 30th. And then, so it'll be for our meeting after that. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, Lynn.
I just want to throw out one more thought for as we're, starting to think about what this entity would look like and what exact function it would perform. There's been talk about advisory roles or this or that, but there seems to be a lot of emphasis on some pretty heavy duty expertise. And I think one of the things we need to keep in mind is, how would we pay for that? So that's just something to throw out there.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. All right. Seeing no other hands being raised, we're adjourned, and we'll see y'all on the 30th. And thank you again to everyone for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.